You're listening to Swinburne's AI in Education podcast. This podcast is being recorded on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the lands in Hawthorn and Melbourne's east and outer east, where Swinburne's campuses are located. We acknowledge the First Peoples are the first teachers, pedagogically caring for country, kin and ancestors. My name is Rowena Ulbrick and I'm Academic Director Digital Literacies at Swinburne University. I'm spearheading Swinburne's AI community of practice. In this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Peter Brace, a lecturer in the Department of Social Sciences at Swinburne, whose teaching spans critical thinking, AI and cognition, and criminology and ethics. He brings a distinctive mix of philosophy, cognitive science, and practical education insight to questions about how humans think, learn, and adapt in the age of artificial intelligence. Together, we explore the philosophical dimensions of AI in teaching and learning, what intelligence really is, what kind of thinking matters most, and what should remain distinctly human. Thanks so much for joining us today, Peter. You're a philosopher, and I'm interested in, as we start to think about the impact of AI on teaching and learning, what can philosophy uniquely bring to the conversation, other than perhaps perspectives that are rooted in technical, policy, or even sort of pedagogical perspectives?
Yeah, good question, Rowena, and I'm really happy to be here. This is such an important topic, I think, so it's great that we're talking about it. So what does philosophy bring? I mean, the thing with AI is that it touches so many aspects of life. And, even when we talk about what it is, right? You say, oh, that's artificial intelligence. What's that? Okay, well, what's intelligence, right? So that's a kind of a definition you could maybe get from psychology, but philosophy would enable you to draw on a wider range of sources and influences. And when we're talking about teaching and learning, I mean, we could talk to the teaching folks about that because they know education really well. But questions like, why do we teach? What does the university exist for? What is its role in society? Those are kind of questions that philosophy has been grappling with for a long time. So I think philosophy brings a perspective that is of necessity really broad to this question.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think there's so much in the media at the moment about universities' social license, and it seems that AI has predicated some of those discussions. But it's really interesting that you're pointing out that these are things that philosophers have been thinking about for long before AI started disrupting education. When we're talking about AI as intelligent, I'm interested in what you think. Look, what does that actually mean? And in what ways is perhaps AI intelligence similar or different to human intelligence?
But the course I teach at Swinburne on critical thinking and intelligence, looks at that question in a lot of detail. And there's lots of different definitions of intelligence. And you need to look at, what does it mean? How does it work? Is it different in the organic world to the what we might call the AI world? And you can see some really interesting similarities and some really interesting differences. I mean, just look at the fundamentals. I mean, they both work on natural laws, right? The same laws of physics that apply to an AI apply to human intelligence. There's nothing supernatural about human intelligence. It's grounded in the same physical systems as AI. So when you compare them, you can see some interesting similarities in the way they work. For example, our intelligence enables us to understand the world and to be able to predict what is going to happen. And it works in that way to support our survival. Not just our individual survival, but our survival as a species, our ability to cooperate and collaborate. And it looks at what's going on in the world. It tries to make a prediction. Intelligence then moves an organism to take action in the world to confirm or deny that prediction and therefore reduce the gap between what's really happening in the world and what it thinks is happening in the world. Because the smaller that gap is, the greater the chance of survival, right? And AI has a very similar way of approaching things in that it looks at what is statistically likely in terms of, the next word or the next phrase or the next question, and looks at, a huge amount of data, but from that works out the probability of certain things being right or wrong. So in that way, they're very, very similar. But obviously, they're very different because human intelligence and all organic intelligence is based on an organism, something that needs to keep itself separate from the world, something that needs to resist entropy, something that needs to survive. So in that way, AI has no what we might call skin in the game. It has no stake in being right or wrong, whereas human intelligence or animal or even plant intelligence does. So, there's important similarities and differences.
That's really interesting to me, and I've never really thought about how the human brain could be thought of as algorithms, and I suppose that's the similarity that you're drawing there. I think why people might feel uncomfortable about that is that it really sees that our behavior is determined rather than having free will, and I think we like to think that we're unique in our thought patterns, and perhaps that reduces it, as an algorithm suggests that maybe we're all not that unique.
Yes, I mean, that's a really good point. We are trying to make our way in the world just as every living thing is, and the principles we use to do that are exactly the same. Now, the question of free will is a whole other philosophical discussion, which we probably won't have today.
We need a whole other
Yeah.
episode for that one,
That's
Peter.
right, but, the ability to make a decision happens in the what we might call the simplest forms of organic life. You see a single-celled organism and it will react to something. It will react to something that it thinks is food and move towards that. It will react to something that it thinks is danger and move away from that. So even within the simplest forms of life, there is some kind of decision making going on, some kind of interpretation of signals from the outside. And that's one of the other things about human or organic intelligence that's a bit different from artificial intelligence. So they're operating in an open system where they're open to the world, whereas AI has very limited channels to the outside world.
Mm, and maybe that's one of those core differentiators is that we can experience things directly, whereas
Yeah.
artificial intelligence can't. And does that mean that that opens up different possibilities for a different type of intelligence? And so we're thinking about things like empathy, ethical judgment, those sort of things. Can AI ever really truly be able to help with those things beyond its theoretical foundations? That's interesting to me too.
Yeah, I mean, you need consciousness really for empathy, don't
Mm.
you? And AI can't really be empathetic, although it can give a very good simulation of empathy in a way that can very easily fool people into thinking that it is empathetic and that it does have consciousness and that it is, in that sense, real.
I think that's where it can sometimes it can be confusing, and how we even interact with it. I always find it funny when people tell me that they really mind their manners when they're using AI and always say please and thank you and well done. I personally don't do that, but I think it's interesting that we engage it almost as if it is if it is human because it is simulating pretty well.
It reacts in a way that makes it look like it is human. And in that way, I don't think it's a bad thing that we react back to it in a human way. We just need to be aware that we're doing that and be careful not to get in too deep.
I'm interested in, yeah, exploring what in too deep could look like a little bit. And I think, certainly when we're speaking to students, research supports this too, is that they're starting to feel that AI is making them more stupid. It can certainly perhaps make us feel more stupid in some ways, but there's clear benefits and opportunities for the types of cognitive work that we could potentially offload. What do you think should be offloaded and what should be distinctly human?
Well, any technology in a way makes us more stupid, doesn't it? Because it does what we can do, and therefore we don't need to do it anymore. But we need to understand what it is that we're doing. For example, the calculator, right? The calculator saves us from doing arithmetic in our head or on paper. But we still need to know the reason why we're adding rather than subtracting, or multiplying rather than dividing, or if we're using a statistical package, why would we use one particular formula against another? So being more stupid in some areas is not necessarily a bad thing. It just, we need to be very careful about which areas they are. And the areas that are distinctly human are the things that the AI cannot do, right? The emotion, the understanding of beauty, the being in the world, those are things that an AI cannot do. Those are things that make us more human. And to a certain extent, modernity has privileged rationality above all those other ways of being human. So AI, in a way, may give us the opportunity to perhaps reclaim some of those uniquely human attributes and focus teaching and learning on some of those.
That's really interesting. And I suppose to think about what that means in terms of learning and teaching is probably stepping away from some of those tried and true assessment practices, which are focused very much on written work, to much more authentic, experiential learning that is focused and rooted within the real world.
Well, a big question about that is, well, what is the purpose of us as a university? What is it that we're supposed to be doing? Are we just making students ready to do a particular job? Or are we helping them to learn more about how the world works and why that matters? I think we've moved a lot away from the traditional view of the universe as somewhere where you develop critical thinking and an understanding of the world, to somewhere that makes you ready to have a job. And you kind of got to address both of those. And some of that depends on what it is you're learning. To look at two examples, if the job that you have to do is to design a bridge to cross a river, then what do you need to learn? You need to learn the laws of physics, you need to learn calculations, you need to learn about materials science, and there's probably a lot of things that AI or some other kind of technology can do to actually do a lot of that work for you. But you still need to be able to understand the principles so that you can check the output that comes out of those before you actually build the bridge and drive your car across it. But look at that different task that's also taught at university. Let's say you're designing a policy to reduce crime amongst culturally and linguistically diverse youth. Now, that's a very different kind of problem that I think needs a very different set of learning to know how to do that. Because first of all, you're dealing with a wicked problem where there is no easy solution. Every solution that you propose is going to bring another problem. So that requires a real understanding of society, the role of crime and deviance in a positive and negative way, understanding that population group and their experiences. They're very different tasks, and very different types of learning are needed for those different kinds of tasks.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I think that's going beyond just what we were saying around authenticity and it being experiential and saying, well, there's got to be a level of complexity around the challenge that they're posed with.
Well,
And rooted in the real world takes it from theoretical to having real tangible outcomes. That brings about that level of complexity that you were using in that example. So I think, we're starting to see some ingredients of perhaps what assessments should look like. I'm wondering your thoughts around those universities that aren't starting to think about assessment in those ways. Do you think that there's a risk of confusing student performance and understanding now that we know that AI can simulate so many of those outward signs of intelligence? Certainly, over the last 3 years, it's gone from being sort of probably a mediocre undergraduate student to PhD level pretty fast. What sort of risks do you think universities face if they don't start to reframe assessment?
Yes, huge risks. The kind of artifacts that we ask students to produce have always been an imperfect reflection of what they really need to know. The essay is kind of like producing a model of the learning. It's not really the learning itself. And the fact that the essay can now be produced by someone other than the student very easily, is obviously a danger. I mean, it's always been possible for students to get someone else to write their essay, right? But it's difficult, expensive to do that. But now, with an AI, it's easy and very cheap. So yes, we do need to change our assessment task in a way that gives us more contact with the student, more opportunities for the student to, speak in a dialogue rather than just a one way. But the biggest issue, I guess, is that we've been going down the road of making assessments more standardized, more easier to mark, quicker to mark, reducing the cost of the educator. And what we're talking about has the potential to drastically increase the cost of education because you'll need that kind of personal attention and personal dialogue with a student.
That's that's really interesting, Peter, because I think that's showing the level of investment that's required from universities in transforming assessment is that knowing your students, designing assessments for specific diverse cohorts of learners, and having those different forms of artifacts like oral assessments, viva voce, solving real world problems in real time. As you said, that's a very different approach to marking that most of us experience day to day, and it is more time consuming. We'll need more educators, not less. It's interesting to see how that's going to shake out, at the type of scale that assessments need to be transformed really quickly.
Yes. And it's a matter of looking to it, well, the student is going to go into the workplace. Likely they are going to be doing work with AI. So, what do they need to know to be able to effectively use AI, still have an understanding of whether the output that comes out of AI is right, and be able to know, what are the right questions to ask? What are the right inputs that you need to design something that will produce the output that you need. So that's difficult because AI is changing so fast and the workplace is changing so fast. It's kind of hard to keep up with that. But you think, basic human skills such as critical thinking, right? That's something that will never be able to be outsourced to AI totally. You need to be able to look at an AI output and think critically about it and to be able to say, is this correct? Is this answering the question that I asked? And is the question that I asked the right question? Because the feedback you get from the AI can indicate to you that you've asked the wrong question. You're working in the wrong area. You're looking at the wrong aspect of this problem. So, there's great capability there for AI to act as like a Socratic questioning, something that challenges you rather than presents an answer to you. Something that asks you, why did you ask that question? What are you trying to do here? What is the outcome you're looking for? Just like someone like Socrates did, a really annoying person that doesn't just take what you think as the truth, that questions you and challenges you. Now, if AI is working like that, it can have a tremendously positive impact on the learning process.
There's very different ways of using AI. Is it in that process, in that critical thinking process, is it producing perspectives, or can you use it to critique the process that you've used along the way? Am I missing anything? To what extent have I answered this question? Is there any gaps? In that part, I think you can see the enormous opportunities for students to use, because that sort of feedback is invaluable, particularly as we know we can actually
start to code agents with personas of industry experts and academics all in one, and using that to kind of guide what the feedback looks like as well, that means having a personalized tutor. Surely we should be able to experience enormous learning gains if we harness it in that way.
Yeah, so some recent researchers came up with a term that I thought was interesting, epistemia, based on epistemology and the study of knowledge. But basically, the impact that AI has in making you think that you've thought about something when you haven't really. So you may put some questions or some information to the AI, it will confidently present you a very clear and coherent answer, and you have the feeling that you've actually come up with that answer yourself. You feel that you have thought about it, and that gives you a level of certainty when actually you haven't thought about it at all. So if we know that AI is producing epistemia in people, and the evidence suggests that this happens after as little as 10 minutes working with an AI, it starts to reduce our level of confidence in being able to think critically. Then the way that we design AI for use within education should be to make us think that we haven't thought, to ask us, "Why do you say that?" "Why have you asked this question? Why have you accepted this answer? Why do you think this is correct?" And again, challenge you and be very effective at raising questions in your mind that you have to think about.
And that's kind of it's a little bit frightening, that research.
Yes, it
And
is.
just to clarify, it's 10 minutes using an AI reduces their confidence in the subject matter versus not?
No, it reduces their ability to think about that subject matter. So already their confidence is reduced within 10 minutes. So, that gives you an idea of how strong that influence is. The fact that we feel that we've thought means that we think less.
And it might actually lead to an an increase in confidence thinking we know it when we actually don't. And that's concerning when we have a high level of self-regulation that's required in navigating higher education, and you having to monitor what you do and don't know, and you help use that as well as, feedback from your tutors, from industry experts to guide that. But if you're getting feedback that in fact that's covered and it's not, I
Yeah.
can see how that could actually, lead to some learning deficits down the line pretty quickly.
Yes, and it's painful, right? When your tutor gives you a bad mark, right? Or your tutor says, "Oh, that's, you haven't really thought about that." Or, it's a difficult process because we love certainty, right? That's the way our brains work. We're constantly looking for certainty in the external world. And when we're given feedback that we're wrong, we're uncertain, that's the painful part of learning. That's the stressful part of learning that we try and avoid, right? It's part of our humanity to try and avoid that. But that's something that at universities and institutes of education, we need to be made to feel that. We need to be made to feel uncertain, a little concerned, because that is what leads to our learning.
Yeah, absolutely. And digging yourself out of the learning pit, so to speak,
Yeah.
and wrestling with ideas and doing things that are hard, but then working through it, developing a methodology, and then coming out of it also leads to resilience. So that when you're faced with those challenges, that feedback that doesn't settle so well, you've got the ability to work it out. And that's a really important capability when we're living and working in a really sort of uncertain world, is being able to be faced with challenges, know that they're hard. I don't know what the answer. This is tricky,
Mhm.
but now I'm going to work through it and get to the other side. That leads to a level of, I think, reflexivity, if you like, in the learning process, that I can see if that's taken away could be difficult in terms of facing the challenges of what happens in the real world.
Yes, that's true. And when you get to a certain level of confidence in a field, then you can look at something and you can go, there's something not right about that. That doesn't look quite right or it doesn't feel right. You don't even know what it is, but there's some tacit knowledge that you have that is enabling you to pick up that this is not right. And then you can go and ask a few more questions about it and do a bit more checking. And then you realize if you never reach that level of confidence and the answers are given to you clearly and competently, but incorrectly, then you're in real danger of just accepting what you're told. And, in the case of either the building of the bridge or the developing of the policy against reducing crime, both of those have significant real world consequences.
Mm. No, absolutely. I'm interested in taking this down to what educators can do because I think at the moment many have concerns about the risks of AI, such as eroding some of the capacities we've discussed, like critical thinking. But we've also discussed that it's really important that students actually know how to use AI because it's going to be everywhere in terms of their work and life beyond university. So I'm wondering, how can educators balance some of those concerns and risks about AI with maintaining that ethical duty of having to teach AI literacy?
Yes, and now we're into the questions of ethics, right? And there's a couple of ways we can approach that. We can create lots of rules and some exceptions to the rules and more rules about when to apply the rules and when to apply the exception to the rule. Or we could have kind of a free for all and very, very loose set of rules and very loose set of enforcement, and that's probably not going to work either. So we need a combination of the two, really. We need to know which areas are not open to compromise and which areas that we will allow compromise in the use of AI. Right? So that's tricky, and it needs to be constantly changing and constantly reviewed. But we need to take an ethical stand. Warwick Fox is one of my favorite ethicists, and he talks about this concept of responsive cohesion. So, in other words, when you have a complex system of many different parts, systems like that work best when there is connection between the parts that are flexible, that are open to review, that are able to be changed and are responsive. So in our approach to the ethics of AI, we need to be really careful about dropping too quickly into rigid rules or too quick to abolish rules and enable a free for all. So we need to look very carefully at what are the areas where no compromise is required and what are the areas where we can be more flexible. And I didn't answer the question at all really there, other than to say that it it's a wicked problem, right?
Of
It's
course,
something we
of
need to look
course.
at very carefully, and we do need a coordinated approach, across the university to look at how AI should be used as administration, in executive processes, in teaching and learning by students, by educators, and continually experiment with this, I think, is one of the ways that we need to do it because it's very hard to find your way with this new technology and it's having such pervasive effects that we need to be you know, careful, but also active in terms of how we're doing this.
And it's heartening to me that many universities, certainly across Australia, I know it was a little bit different in the US, developed guidelines around AI use initially before the hard and fast policy rules came in. So it seems that that's actually a good approach, perhaps striking the balance between having rules but actually that then there is a level of flexibility around them. They're not so hard and fast. That I know that some of the reasons for that was you develop a policy and the development's moving so fast that it needs to be a policy that's almost updated daily to match the technology itself, and guidelines perhaps were developed in more of a necessity. But I think this is a different perspective that you've taken that actually allows flexibility for the nuance that's required in that fine line between concern and cautiously embracing the technology, not accepting it as it is and letting it drive what we're doing day to day in the classroom, but also having some broad guidelines to guide what we do is really important.
Yes, and we know that AI has a tremendous environmental impact as well. I think that's something that will be solved in time, and I hope that is sooner rather than later. But we need to take that into account as well, and ensure that we're not promoting a technology that is causing horrendous problems to the ecology.
Absolutely. And I know it's a concern, certainly, that I'm hearing frequently, not just, from academics, from educators, but certainly beyond. And the thought that a single prompt uses the same amount of energy as charging your phone overnight. It's concerning if you think about how much we're using it. Sometimes you'd be using it all day long for in various different tasks. So yeah, I agree. It's definitely a concern, and it would be fantastic if it could be solved, and will need to be if we're going to ensure the sustainability of the planet.
Yes, and you also need to look at that holistically as well, right? So if we're using AI to do something, is it saving work somewhere else, right? Is it saving carbon footprint elsewhere? So it's easy to look at it at an individual prompt and say, oh, it uses this much water and this much electricity, but is that use of that prompt saving you from traveling, from spending hours using some other kind of technology that's also contributing to global warming or whatever. So look at it holistically as well, not just in isolation.
That's excellent advice. Thanks, Peter. And just finally, what does responsible AI use in universities actually look like beyond policy slogans?
That's a really hard question to answer, but it's got to start with, well, why are we here? What are we trying to do as a university? What is our role now? And I think that's something that has changed so much over the past even, 10, 20 years, that it's something that needs to be revisited and to look at, well, what are we trying to teach people in our university? And just looking at those kind of trivial examples again, how to build a bridge or how to create a policy that reduces crime, because they are very different outcomes. And so, how does a university present a consolidated educational experience that can enable both of those types of learning? And so, once we have a clearer picture of that, then I think only then can we start to look at questions like, well, what does responsible AI use in universities actually look like?
I think that's a lovely place to finish. Peter, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Rowena. Great to be here. Great questions. Really appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion. Thank you.